There's a moment just before dawn when the world holds its breath. The air feels lighter, almost untouched, and if you're quiet enough, you can hear the whisper of life waking up, but most of us don't notice. We're still buried in the thick fog of yesterday's worries, already rehearsing tomorrow's plans. We rise from bed, but we don't truly wake up. I once met a man who spent 3 weeks in a coma after a car accident. When he finally opened his eyes, he didn't ask for his phone or his bank account balance or even news about his job. He simply asked the nurse to open the window. The first breath of fresh air on his face made him cry. He said, "I thought I'd never feel this again." We call that a miracle, but maybe the real miracle is that every single morning, air like that is waiting for us. We just forget to notice. The Buddha once compared life to a rare and precious jewel, floating for a moment in an endless ocean. And yet we live as if we have an endless supply of mornings, as if our breaths are infinite. This is the sleep of habit, a slow, quiet forgetting. We walk the same streets, see the same faces, drink the same coffee, and somewhere along the way, the mind stops looking. The colors fade, the sounds blur. Days merge into one another until they are not days at all, just numbers on a calendar. And here's the hidden cost. When the mind stops noticing, it stops living. Zen masters call this dying before you die. It's not a physical death, but a shrinking of the soul. You're breathing, but you're not alive. You're moving, but not awake. And yet, awakening is always one breath away. Sometimes it comes suddenly, a near-death experience, a loss, a crisis that shakes you hard enough to tear the veil from your eyes. But it doesn't have to be tragedy that wakes us. It can be a morning breeze, the laughter of a child, the weight of your own heartbeat in your chest. Life is always speaking to us. It says, look, listen, feel, I am here. The question is, are we paying attention? There's a story from the Zen tradition. A monk asked his teacher, "What is the miracle of life?" The master replied, "I am eating rice, I am drinking tea. This is the miracle." It sounds so simple, almost disappointing if you're searching for something grand. But the truth is, miracles are rarely wrapped in fireworks. They hide in plain sight. They are in the cup of tea warming your hands, the sound of rain on the roof, the way sunlight curls through the curtains. They are in the quiet inhale you didn't have to earn, and the exhale that asks nothing in return. To awaken from the sleep of habit is not to add more to your life, but to strip away the blindness, to see what has always been there. And maybe, if we begin to notice again, to really notice, each day will stop feeling like a repeat of the last. It will feel like it does for a man taking his first breath after weeks in darkness. Unrepeatable, undeserved, and unspeakably precious. So take a moment, close your eyes, and open them as if for the first time. Look around. The life you have now, this very moment, will never come again. And yet, if you are here, awake enough to see it, that is already the first miracle. Not long ago, I watched a little boy discover rain for the very first time. He stood at the doorway, eyes wide, watching the silver threads fall from the sky. At first he hesitated, unsure whether this strange shimmering curtain was friend or foe. Then without warning, he ran straight into it. The cold drops hit his skin and he squealed in shock and delight. He looked up, mouth open to catch the falling sky. He didn't care that his clothes were soaked, that his shoes were muddy, that the grown-ups were telling him to come inside. In that moment, he was completely, gloriously alive. And I thought, when did we stop living like that? Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, we traded wonder for routine. We learned to name things, and in naming them, we stopped seeing them. A flower became just a flower. A bird became just a bird. Rain became just weather. But to a child, a flower is an explosion of color. A bird is a miracle that sings. Rain is the sky's way of touching the earth. Zen calls this Shoshin beginner's mind. It's the art of meeting life as if you've never been here before. It's not about ignorance, but about innocence, a kind of openness that refuses to let yesterday's knowledge blind today's vision. The Buddha said, "In the seeing there is only the seen. No story, no label, no judgment, just pure contact with reality." But here's the thing, you can't force this freshness. You can't grit your teeth and command yourself to be amazed. You have to slow down enough for the world to reveal itself. like watching clouds drift across the sky, until you notice shades of white you've never seen before, or tasting your morning tea so slowly that you can feel the steam in your lungs. Children do this naturally, because they haven't built walls of certainty around their minds. They live in a world that is endlessly new, and maybe that's why they laugh more easily, cry more openly, and recover from pain more quickly. The tragedy is not that we grow older. The tragedy is that we grow blind. We start thinking we've seen it all, when in truth, we've only stopped looking. But this blindness isn't permanent. It's more like dust on a window. Wipe it away, and the light floods back in. So here's an invitation. The next time you walk outside, pretend you've just landed on this planet. Notice the weight of your feet on the ground, the texture of the air on your skin, the way sunlight bounces off a stranger's hair, the flicker in their eyes when they smile. You don't have to chase miracles. They're already here, hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to see them, with the same wide, fearless eyes you once had as a child, because maybe those eyes were never lost. They were just waiting for you to remember how to open them. There's a cherry blossom tree in a small temple courtyard I visit every spring. For 11 months of the year, it stands quietly, branches bare, almost invisible among the other trees. Then one morning, without warning, it explodes into a cloud of pink and white. For a week, maybe two, it looks like something out of another world. Petals float down like slow-motion snow, catching in people's hair, landing on the stone steps like blessings. And then it's gone. The branches empty again. The ground swept clean. If you came too early, you missed it. If you came too late, you missed it. That is impermanence, and it is what makes the blossoms beautiful. The Buddha taught Anika the truth that nothing lasts. Every moment, every breath, every heartbeat is already slipping away as it happens. It's not a flaw in life's design, it is the design. We often think permanence would bring us comfort. If only things could stay the same, if only moments could be frozen, we would be happy. But permanence would make life dull, stripping it of urgency, of the sweetness that comes from knowing this won't come again. Imagine if the cherry blossoms bloomed all year. Would people still travel from far away to see them? Would they stand under the branches in awe, their eyes stinging with tears? Or would they walk past without noticing, because there's always tomorrow? Impermanence sharpens the edges of our attention. It whispers, look closely, this is fleeting. It makes us hold our loved ones a little tighter, say, I love you before the moment passes, watch a sunset until the last thread of light disappears. But impermanence isn't only about beauty. It is also the quiet promise that pain too will pass. No winter is endless. No night is without a dawn. When you're trapped in sorrow, impermanence is the door that will eventually open. When you're lost in joy, impermanence is the reminder to be fully there while it lasts. A Zen teacher once said, because everything changes, everything matters. It's true, the fragility of life is not something to fear, but something to honor. So the next time you notice something beautiful, the way light rests on your friend's face, the taste of fruit at its ripest, the laughter that comes without warning, don't rush past it. Pause, let it sink in, because it will end. And that's why it matters. The blossoms will always fall. The petals will always scatter. But if you're there to see them, if you're truly there, you'll carry that moment in your heart, long after the branches are bare. I'm holding a cup of tea. It seems simple, just hot water and dried leaves. But if you look closely, this tea is a gathering of the entire universe. There's the rain that fell on the hillside where the tea grew, the soil that cradled its roots, made rich by centuries of fallen leaves and tiny living creatures. The hands of the farmer who woke before sunrise to tend the plants, his body nourished by food grown in other fields, harvested by other hands, the sun that rose each day to draw the leaves toward the sky, the wind that carried the clouds that carried the rain, and even here in my home, someone built the cup I'm holding. Someone fired the clay, someone transported it across cities or seas, someone stocked it on a shelf, someone turned on the electricity that heated the water I poured. 1,000 invisible threads, woven into the moment I now lift this cup to my lips. This is Pradityasamutpada, the Buddhist teaching of interdependent origination. Nothing exists on its own. Nothing appears by itself. Every breath, every meal, every smile is the product of countless conditions, stretching far beyond what the eye can see. When we forget this, we begin to believe the illusion of separateness. We think we stand alone, that our lives are self-made, that our actions are isolated. But in truth, to harm another is to harm ourselves. To care for another is to care for the very web that sustains us. Think of a spider's web shimmering in the morning light. Touch one strand, and the entire web trembles. Our lives are like that. Each action, each word, each choice ripples outward, touching people we may never meet. Even your existence right now is the result of uncountable lives before you, ancestors you've never known, plants and animals that nourished your body, teachers who shaped your mind, friends and strangers who offered kindness without keeping score. Gratitude is not just a polite habit, it's a recognition of reality. It's the awareness that we are here only because everything else is here. When you drink your tea, you are drinking clouds and sunlight and centuries of Earth's memory. When you eat a grain of rice, you are tasting the labor of farmers, the patience of the seasons, the blessing of rain that did not have to fall but did. And maybe, if we truly saw this web that holds us together, we would speak more gently, walk more softly, and treat the world not as a possession, but as a shared home we are all responsible for. Because nothing, not even the smallest breath you take right now, happens alone. I once watched a man eat lunch while scrolling through his phone. His fork moved automatically, bite after bite disappearing without a single glance at the food. 10 minutes later, his plate was empty, but he had no memory of tasting a single thing. We've all done it, eating while thinking about work, walking while replaying an argument, listening while planning what to say next. Our bodies are here, but our minds are somewhere else, and in that gap, life slips through unnoticed. The Buddha called this sati, mindfulness, not a mystical trance, not an escape from reality, but the opposite, an intimate meeting with reality, right here, right now. It's the art of inhabiting this breath, this step, this sip of water, so fully that nothing is left behind. Thich Nh letter 1ea5t h letter 1ea1nh once said, "When you drink tea, only drink tea." It sounds simple, but it's a radical act in a world addicted to distraction. When you're mindful, the smallest acts expand into something luminous. Washing dishes becomes a meditation on warmth and texture, the weight of the bowl in your hands, the scent of soap in the air, the swirl of water circling the drain. Walking down the street becomes a journey through shifting light and shadow, footsteps keeping time with the rhythm of your heartbeat. Mindfulness doesn't change the world outside you, it changes the way you meet it. And when you meet life fully, you find that nothing is too small to matter, but mindfulness is more than attention. It is also acceptance, to be here without trying to bend the moment into something else, to watch the rain fall without wishing it would stop, to feel sadness without rushing to escape. This doesn't mean you stop acting in the world. It means you stop abandoning the world as it is. You stop abandoning yourself. The practice can begin anywhere. Take one mindful breath before answering the phone. Feel your feet on the floor before you speak. Notice the pause between two heartbeats. Each time you return to the present, you strengthen the muscle of awareness. And the more you do it, the more you realize life is not something that happens later. It's not waiting for the perfect moment, the next vacation, the right circumstances. Life is in the steam rising from your tea, in the smile of the cashier handing you change, in the sound of your own laughter echoing in a room. To be mindful is to stop postponing your life. It is to step fully into it, with both feet and both eyes wide open, because this moment, exactly as it is the only place you can ever truly be alive. Every morning a man walks the same route to work, same street, same buildings, same gray sky above. One day a friend asks him, "How many windows are on that corner cafe you pass every day?" He shrugs. He's walked by it for 10 years, but he's never actually seen it. This is the prison of habit. The mind loves efficiency. It learns patterns, locks them in, and runs them on autopilot. It's how you can drive home from work and barely remember the journey. It's how you can hold a conversation and not recall the words you spoke. Habit isn't bad in itself, it helps us survive. You don't want to relearn how to tie your shoes every morning, but the same mechanism that frees your mind for survival can also steal your aliveness. Because when the mind decides something is already known, it stops looking. And when it stops looking, it stops feeling wonder. The ordinary becomes invisible. The world becomes a background blur. And before you realize it, whole years pass without a single moment that takes your breath away. The Buddha often spoke about sati, mindfulness, as the antidote to this blindness. But he also warned about the pull of samsara, the cycle of going through life half asleep, chasing the same routines, expecting them to bring joy. Think of the last time you traveled somewhere new. Every street felt alive. Every meal tasted different. Every face caught your attention. Now imagine living with that same alertness, without ever leaving your hometown. It's possible, but it requires breaking the walls of habit that tell you you've seen this before, it's nothing special. Sometimes all it takes is a small change. Take a different route. Sit in a new chair at the dinner table. Look up at the sky at a time you normally wouldn't. Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few." Habit makes us experts at life, and that's exactly how we lose it. We don't have to abandon routines, but we do have to wake up inside them, to notice the angle of light in your kitchen at sunrise, the way your partner's hair falls differently each morning, the faint smell of rain before it arrives. The prison door is always open, but you have to step out, one deliberate, curious moment at a time, because the ordinary is never truly ordinary unless you choose not to see it. I once visited a man in the hospital who had just recovered from pneumonia. His lungs had been so weak that even the smallest breath felt like fire. On the day he was well enough to drink a glass of cold water, he held it as if it were made of gold. He took a slow sip and tears rolled down his face. "You don't know how precious this is," he whispered. "But the truth is, we all once knew. We've just forgotten." Gratitude is not about having more. It's about seeing more, recognizing the quiet gifts that already surround us. The Buddha spoke of katanuta, the ability to remember kindness, not just the kindness of people, but the kindness of the world itself, the way the sun warms your skin, the way the earth grows food without complaint, the way your heart beats faithfully without needing your command. When gratitude is alive in you, ordinary moments transform. The steam rising from your tea is no longer just steam. It's the sky, the rain, the hands that pick the leaves. The hug from a friend is no longer just a greeting. It's a shelter, a reminder that you are not alone in this vast and shifting world. Gratitude turns scarcity into abundance. It doesn't mean life will be perfect, but it means life will never be empty. There's a simple practice I sometimes share. Before you sleep, name 3 things from your day that you're grateful for. Not the big, dramatic things, just the small ones. The smell of bread in the morning, the smile from a stranger, the way sunlight painted your wall in the late afternoon. At first it may feel awkward, like forcing your mind to search for something worthy. But over time, you realize the world is overflowing with gifts, most so subtle they hide in plain sight. In Zen, they say, the miracle is not to walk on water, but to walk on the earth. To live with gratitude is to finally notice you've been walking on holy ground all along. And maybe, when you live this way, you stop asking life for more and start thanking it for what it's already given. Because in the end, a glass of water, a deep breath, and a heart that can feel are already enough to make this day a wonder. Sometimes life speaks to us in whispers, the warmth of morning light, the taste of fresh fruit, the laughter of a friend. But sometimes, life raises its voice. I once met a man who had spent decades chasing promotions, living in airports more than in his own home. One day, on the way to another meeting, his heart betrayed him. A sudden pain, a collapse. When he woke in the hospital, the doctor told him plainly, You were minutes away from not waking at all. He told me it was the first time in years he really saw the faces of the nurses, the creases on their brows, the tired kindness in their eyes. It was the first time in years he noticed the sound of rain on the window and realized he had been sleeping through his own life. Not all wake-up calls are dramatic. Sometimes they come as a quiet loss, a friend moving away, a parent's hair turning white, a child who suddenly no longer fits in your arms the way they used to. These moments have a way of shaking the snow globe of our habits, making everything float for a moment, forcing us to look again. Buddhism teaches that dukkha, suffering or dissatisfaction, is not meant to punish us, but to alert us. Like a bell calling monks to meditation, life's difficulties call us to awaken. And awakening is not always gentle. Sometimes the call is an illness, sometimes a loss, sometimes the quiet realization that you've been walking in circles. The Zen masters say, enlightenment is an accident, practice makes you accident-prone. We can't schedule our awakening, but we can prepare ourselves to notice when it comes. Because here's the truth, the wake-up calls will come whether we're ready or not. The question is, will we pick up? When the job you built your identity on disappears, when the person you thought you couldn't live without leaves, when the mirror shows a face you barely recognize. These are not life's cruelty. They are invitations. Invitations to see that nothing is guaranteed, that this breath, this heartbeat, this moment, is a miracle borrowed from the void, and maybe, if we listen closely, we'll realize the wake-up calls aren't here to take something from us, but to give us the only thing we ever truly needed, our life, fully lived, before it's gone. We don't have to wait for a crisis to wake up. We can train ourselves to notice the miracle in the ordinary so that every day feels like a gift, not a routine. Here's the truth. Miracle seeing is a skill, like playing an instrument. It grows sharper the more you practice. Let me share a few ways to begin. First, begin with the breath. Before the phone, before the news, before you even get out of bed, place one hand on your chest and just feel your breathing. No matter what is happening in your life, this rhythm, inhale, exhale, is the simplest proof that you are still here. The Buddha once said, with every breath we are born again. What if you lived as if that were true? Second, name one thing. At any moment, pause and name one thing in front of you as if you were seeing it for the first time. The cup of tea in your hand, the way sunlight falls across the floor, the texture of the paper you're holding. If you slow down enough, even a chipped mug can feel like a sculpture. Even a street corner can feel like a painting. Third, break one habit a day. Routine numbs us, change sharpens us. Take a different route to work. Eat lunch somewhere new. Speak to the neighbor you've only nodded to for years. When you break your pattern, the world rushes in with details you've been blind to. Fourth, listen deeply. Not just to people, but to everything. The wind through leaves, the hum of the refrigerator, the pauses in a friend's voice when they say, I'm fine. Most of life's miracles aren't loud. They're waiting in the quiet. Fifth, remember impermanence. Every time you see something beautiful, say silently to yourself, this will not last. It may sound sad, but it's not. It's what makes the moment shine. When you know the flower will wilt, you inhale its scent more deeply. When you know your child will grow, you hold them closer tonight. The truth is, life will still get messy. You'll still forget, still get caught up, still scroll through hours of noise. But if you can return, even for a moment, to the breath, to the small detail, to the fragile beauty in front of you, then you are already living the miracle. And here's the best part. When you train your eyes to see wonder in the ordinary, you don't just change your own life, you become a mirror for others. They see the way you look at the world, and they start to look too. And maybe this is how we change the world. Not by waiting for everyone to wake up at once, but by living as proof that every day is worth noticing. Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and you know without doubt that this is both your very first day on earth and your very last. What would you notice? The warmth of your blanket, the way light filters through the curtains, the voice of someone you love calling your name. You wouldn't rush. You wouldn't scroll past the morning sky. You wouldn't swallow your coffee without tasting it. You would drink the world in, its colors, its textures, its laughter, its silences, because you would know you'll never see them quite this way again. Living this way doesn't mean ignoring pain or pretending life is perfect. It means being so alive to each breath that joy can slip in through the smallest cracks. It means holding life gently, like you would hold a bird in your hands, aware that it could fly away at any moment. Buddha taught that life is precious because it is fleeting. If we live each day as if it is both our first and our last, we meet the world with wonder and we leave it without regret. So today is here. The miracle has already arrived, and you right now are standing inside it. If these words have touched something in you, if you want to keep walking this path of awareness, gratitude, and quiet wonder, then join us here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe not just to a channel, but to a way of seeing the world where every sunrise is a gift and every moment is enough, because life will not always be this way. And that is exactly why it is beautiful.